Good afternoon. Here we are again with our Sunday afternoon series at the Dartmouth History and Arts Society. And this afternoon we have our speaker, Richard Gifford, who's a regular speaker with us because he is so popular and brings such good material. Today's subject has to do with the Watuppa Native American Reservation over near Watuppa Pond and the history of how that all developed. It's always a pleasure to welcome Richard here, and we look forward to many more visits. So without any further ado, I welcome again Richard Gifford.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk today about the Watuppa Wampanoag Reservation. I think this is part of a number of advances which a number of us, I think, are on the verge of making some significant discoveries about the lives of local Indians, which I know is a subject of interest to a lot of us and which we really don't know very much about. I'm going to start talking with Watuppa by talking about Colonel Benjamin Church, who some of you have probably heard of. He was the founder of Little Compton. He moved there in 1674 and built 2 houses. And then when King Philip's War started the following year, he became involved with as a leader of soldiers. And the war was not, frankly, going well for the English against King Philip. The English would come in and they would fight in their English style with the guys beating the drums and playing the fifes and what have you. And that may have been a way to fight the English civil wars over in the old country, but it wasn't much use to fighting the Indians, who could hear them coming, the colonists, a mile away, slip into the woods, circle around behind them, and ambush them. So it occurred to Church that there had to be a better way of getting some results. And he petitioned the government, which was at Plymouth at the time, Old Dartmouth, Little Compton, and Tiverton, still part of Plymouth Colony until 1692. And he gained leave to recruit a company of Indians to fight for the English side. And these were either entirely or almost entirely Sakonnet Indians. These are the tribe that lived in Little Compton, who he was already familiar with because of his living there. The Sakonnets, at first during King Philip's War, had been neutral and then came over to the side of the English. And the reason I mention this stuff about Benjamin Church and King Philip's War is because Watuppa Reservation, when it comes to be founded in 1701, is different from any other Indian reservation of this area or anywhere else as far as my knowledge is concerned, in that it was established for a specific group of Indians. It was not a particular tribe, not Indians who lived in a particular area. It was established for the company of Indians under the command of Captain James Church, as he's described in the records, who fought with the English not only in King Philip's War, but in the subsequent wars. In the 1690s and in the first decade of the 1700s, there was a series of wars. The first group was called King William's War. The second group of conflicts called Queen Anne's War. 5 times Benjamin Church took what he called the Eastern Expeditions. These were fought in what we now know as Maine. Quebec at the time still controlled by the French, New England, of course, by England. This international conflict manifested itself locally by continuous conflict between these two countries that really lasts from 1689 up until the end of the French and Indian War in the 1750s. And Church was involved in the first part. The last of his expeditions would have been in 1704. The reservation was established, and here on this map, the location of the reservation is at the juncture of Indiantown Road, which is here, and Blossom Road, running north and south. It's in Fall River, just a little bit north of where the Westport line is. A little further up here where the Fall River Water Department has its headquarters would be just to the north boundary of this map. This map is from 1858. The first one listed on this is 1850 Walling map here. I'll start with this guy. Wesson Gifford here is my great-great-great-grandfather. Next south of him is Leonard Gifford, my great-great-grandfather. Most of these people are just, white people living in this area. As I said, the reservation itself is down at near the intersection. It's a rectangular area, originally set out 195 acres. It stretches from the shore of North Watuppa until roughly this area here. It's about 1.5 miles going from east to west, and probably about a half a mile north to south. It is not the original location of the reservation. In 1701, the land for the original reservation was obtained by Massachusetts Bay Colony from Daniel Wilcox. Wilcox had acted as a translator for Benjamin Church. He had also bought land directly from the Indians in the Ocoxit area of Westport and in Little Compton. And when the Sakonnet proprietors, who were the purchasers from Duxbury of Little Compton land, came to stake out their claims, he interfered, Wilcox interfered with them, probably had some of his Indian friends threaten them a bit. He was arrested for interfering with, His Majesty's His Majesty's ministers in carrying out this lawful land purchase. And so he was fined rather heavily, 150 pounds. He fled Rhode Island, he fled Massachusetts and went over into Rhode Island, which in those days, Aquidneck Island. He was over in Portsmouth. His family stayed behind in what is now Tiverton, which would have been part of Massachusetts until 1743. Wilcox wanted to be able to come back to reunite with his family. He arranged with Church, his friend from back in King Philip's War, when Wilcox had been an interpreter for him, to make a deal with the government that Wilcox would surrender 160 acres of his land, and in exchange, the government would forgive the fine. And that was the original reservation, which is about maybe 3 miles to the southwest of this location. It's on the west shore of South Watuppa Pond, just north of the current Tiverton Fall River line. If you're familiar with Notre Dame Cemetery on Stafford Road in Fall River. It's in that area. The Indians did not stay at that reservation very long. In 1706, there was a petition of the Indians to move the reservation. And I find it interesting. You know, you think, well, they're Indians, they should have Indian names. But if you look down the list, and we have no doubt that they're Indians, but the Indians listed Captain James Church, Nebbie Manchester, James Wilcox, John Burgess, Job David, Thomas Sessin, which is probably Sisson, along with a few who sound more like Indians, Moses Quiaquin, John Cockaway, Sam Quiaquin. And that's one of the difficulties, by the way, in trying to find Indians in vital records, is that even when they do appear, they often appear with very English-sounding names. So unless they're identified as Indian in the vital record, it's difficult to figure out that they are. So in 1786, they petitioned to move the reservation to its modern location. The Wilcox land was swapped with land already owned by Benjamin Church at the modern location, 195 acres. And in exchange for donating the new reservation land, Benjamin Church received the old reservation. And that was accomplished in 1709. The deed for the original reservation, by this time, you know, Massachusetts has title to the land, and it's conveyed to the Indians by a deed requiring, in lieu of rents or services, that the Indians should provide 1/4 of good venison to the governor each December 10th. I don't know how long they kept that up, but I suppose to be in compliance, they would go to the governor's office even now and give them 1/4 of venison, and that keeps them in good standing for another year. In the early days of the reservation, there's very, very few records. The next batch of records after that original petition comes in 1763, when there is a petition by Isaac Church and others who describe themselves as Indians in the former wars. Isaac Church, by the way, a son of Captain James Church, to divide the Watuppa lands in severalty that had previously been assigned to Captain James Church and 24 privates who had fought in the Indian Wars. The land originally was divided into 25 lots. Captain James Church got a lot that was about 28 acres. The other lots were just under 7 acres in size. And in 1763 was the first systematic survey of this land showing the original occupants of the lots. By that time, a lot of the original inhabitants had died, and it was established as a principle that the land could be passed on as a type of inheritance to the Indians' legal heirs, but many of them had died without leaving any heirs. But there was another group of Indians who had fought, presumably in some of the later Eastern Expedition Wars, so probably in the 1690s or in the 1704 expedition under Benjamin Church, who had not procured land under the original division. And this group included a company of Indians that fought under Lieutenant Robin Manchester. And so those lots that had been vacated were now assigned to a new group that came in 1763. And shortly after that, in 1764, 1765, there was a survey done of kind of a census-type survey of Indians. There were 59 Indians living in Freetown at the time. Most or all of them would have been living at Watuppa Reservation. In the 1763 group, among these new people who were coming in, you had some who were still descended from this church family. There are quite a number of the Indians. I don't know if they were related or not. The original group, you had Captain James Church, Old Sam Church, Young Samuel Church, and Joshua Church, so quite a few named churches. They probably took that name as just an honorific to Benjamin Church. I suspect that Captain James Church is one of two Sakonnet Indians. There was a Sakonnet named Lightfoot, and there was another Sakonnet named Numpash, and is both referred to by Benjamin Church in his narrative of King Philip's War. The reason I suspect it's one of those two is because they're the only two Indians who are referred to by the rank of captain at any point in Church's narrative. At the 1763 group, you have 4 grandchildren of a man named Peter Washunk. And I think Peter Washunk is probably a grandson of Awashunks, who was they call it the squaw sachem of the Sakonnet tribe, who dealt with Benjamin Church and had several meetings with him. We do know that she had a son, Peter Awashunks, who was an adult during King Philip's War. This Peter Washunk is probably the son of the elder and therefore grandson of Awashunks. In the 1690s in Little Compton, there's a record of a Peter Awashunks who is an indentured servant to Edward Richmond. And so apparently what happened in his case is that the younger Peter Washunk at some point became a member of the one of Church's Eastern expedition, and so acquired, like all the others would have had to have had, acquired a status as a soldier, fighting with English forces either in King Philip's War for the first group or for the various expeditions in Maine which were fought in the 1690s and into the early 1700s. Church was commissioned in these Eastern expeditions. He had a company of 50 Indians. These, depending on the expedition, between 100 and 200 white soldiers. Maine was a wild, unsettled place. France and England didn't agree where the boundary was. It was not a separate colony. Maine was part of Massachusetts, which explains why Massachusetts men kept going up there. But it was basically a guerrilla war. The French were using the Abenaki Federation tribesmen to make raids on one of the few English settlements. Church and others who were involved in those campaigns would kind of make counter raids into the Indian territory. Out in the west, the English had as allies the Iroquois nation. They would make raids from upstate New York into Canada, into the area around Montreal, and where there were quite a few, even by that time, quite a few French settlements. So that in a sense, both sides were using Indians as proxies to fight these wars between England and France. There was a long tradition of military service by the Indians at Watuppa. It was obviously beginning at King Philip's War, through the French and Indian Wars, and now up at the time of the Revolution, we come to a man I think is a great-grandson of Captain James Church, who's an Indian named Daniel Page, who lives at the reservation. And in 1777, Page was a volunteer boat handler on whaleboats that were used in the American raid that captured General Prescott in Middletown, one of the more famous local episodes of the American Revolution. Page was written about by the Durfee, I've forgotten his first name, but he was the author of the Durfee genealogy, who knew Page personally as a young boy. And Page was one of the two men that escorted General Prescott out of the house, still in his bedclothes, into the boat. The boat, they started from Warwick Neck and they came around the southern end of Prudence Island and landed over by the Portsmouth-Middletown boundary where Prescott Farm can still be found. Captured him, were bringing him back to the boat, and they started going down to the boat, and Page said, wait a minute, we forgot to get his sword, which was a valuable keepsake. So Page turns around, goes back to the house, gets through the sentry somehow, gets the sword, gets back to the boat, and General Prescott is captured. He's exchanged for General Charles Lee, an American commander who had been captured at another battle. In the same regiment, although not on this particular raid, was another man who figures in large part in the genealogies of later Indians at Watuppa, and that is Ebenezer Crank. Ebenezer Crank marries another descendant of Captain James Church. And some of these marriages are in the vital records. That's another way that people sometimes got on the reservation, is that personally you didn't have to be a descendant. If you, for example, if you were a man who married a woman who was entitled to a lot at the reservation, you could get on the reservation that way, because people were always moving on the reservation, off the reservation. But Peleg Crank married a woman in Freetown named Phoebe Simon, whose mother was Simon Simons, her mother Thankful Ward. Thankful Ward was a daughter of Daniel Ward and Experience Church. Experience Church was the daughter of Captain James Church. So there's kind of an unbroken line that comes with the Crank family, who you can see on the maps from the 1850s, are still living at Watuppa. Here on this map, which is the 1850 map, this is Henry Crank, he's a descendant of Captain James Church, who had lived here since, whose descendants had lived here since 1701. Also, you see William Perry, and this is his mother here, Mrs. Hannah Perry. I also deal with Ruth Cuff. Ruth Cuff is a niece of Paul Cuffey. Her father was David Cuffey, Paul's older brother, and her mother was Hope Page, who was Daniel Page's sister. And she was an Indian doctress, kind of like Charlotte White was in Westport. They had herbal remedies and such that they would sell not just to people of color, but sold to white people too. Hannah Perry was the mother of William Perry. She was, her maiden name was Crank. She was the daughter of Peleg Crank and Phoebe Simon. Hannah Crank, and her death record, she died in 1864, her death record from Fall River gives her parents, which is very helpful genealogically. She married David Perry, who was from Natick. He wasn't born at the reservation, but he was another example of someone who comes, in a sense, from off the reservation and marries someone who is entitled to a lot there. And their son, Dr. William Perry, lived at the reservation most of his life. He lived from 1820 to 1896. The contemporary record tells us that he was a very good skater. I got that from a newspaper account that talked about him. He was also a doctor. They called him a botanical doctor. So again, what we might call today an herbalist, someone who deals in these various traditional Indian methods of healing. I mentioned Daniel Page. Let's see if we can find the lineage of Daniel Page. Yes, his mother was Comfort Ward, and we find her in the Tiverton Vital Records in 1746, married William Page, who was a mulatto. Her parents were Experienced Church and Daniel Ward, the same ancestors, Experienced Church being a daughter of Captain James Church and being the same lineage as the Crank and Perry families. In 1849, there was a report to the legislature stating that there were 37 Fall River Indians living at the reservation, and those were enumerated, mostly in the Crank and Perry and Cuffey family, although the Cuffeys were dying out by that time. And the next activity which we have in the records involving the reservation is the petition of Zerviah Gould Mitchell, who was a descendant of Massasoit and also a descendant of Tuspaquin, who was called the Black Sachem of Assawamsett. Tuspaquin had been, here's a photograph of Zerviah Gould Mitchell here. Tuspaquin was an advisor to Philip. He was an ally of Philip and conducted a raid on Middleborough during King Philip's War. Now you might say, well, wait a minute. I thought the reservation was for soldiers who fought with the English, and Watuppa Reservation was. But the son of Tespacquin, who was an ally and relative of King Philip, Benjamin Tespacquin, fought with the English not in King Philip's War, but in King William's War, in those eastern expeditions which Benjamin Church conducted. But Zerviah Gould Mitchell was also descended from John Sassaman. Those of you who remember your King Philip's War history, John Sassaman, who was an interpreter, an Indian who was educated at Harvard, had been a kind of go-between between the English and King Philip, became an advisor to Philip, and was, according to the information that's come down to us, killed on the orders of King Philip by 3 Indians at Assawamsett Pond in Lakeville, in which killing and the arrest of and execution of 3 Wampanoags by the English for the murder was a precipitating factor leading to King Philip's War. So Zerviah Gould Mitchell had this lineage from Massasoit, also from John Sassaman, and there were others earlier on the reservation who had a similar lineage. Her great-grandfather was a man named Benjamin Squinamay, which is really Benjamin Tespacquin Jr. So that early one was a grandson of Tespacquin, and 2 of his granddaughters had been awarded land at Watuppa back in the 1763 division. So Zerviah Gould Mitchell has her claims heard by John Milton Earl, who was appointed a commissioner by the Massachusetts legislature. I'll mention Earl again in a moment. She was not welcomed by the other Indians at the reservation. She and her husband built a house there. The house was vandalized by the other Indians. They broke the windows. Earl heard the claims, validated her claims of entitlement and ancestry, but basically concluded that it would be best for all concerned to have her go back to Lakeville, where she had come from and where she did spend the rest of her life. In 1861, Earl conducted a census of all Massachusetts Indians, regardless of where they lived. Not only, some of them were not even living in Massachusetts. There were some, like some of the Wayner families, that were mining in Australia at the time and are listed in this Earl census. And along with the actual enumeration of Indians that Earl found, he provided a lot of commentary about the various reservations. Earl reported there were 78 Fall River Indians, and he called it a term, by Fall River Indians, it's a term used as a matter of convenience to describe those Indians who served the whites in the company of Captain James Church and Indians serving under Colonel Benjamin Church in the war against King Philip. Earl's report on the conditions at Watuppa in the mid-1800s makes for depressing reading. The Indians who were left there lived in conditions of dire poverty. Some were receiving state assistance. Some refused it as a matter of principle. They didn't think out of pride or what have you. They would not accept state assistance. Others who accepted it justified it to themselves on the basis that this was a form of repayment from land that had been seized by the white men from their ancestors. Some of the Indians were attending, some of the children were attending school, some were going to church, but Earl said that illegitimacy was very high, that a kind of spirit of just plain helplessness pervaded in the reservation. There was very little land that was actually under cultivation, that most of the land was just rented out to white farmers who lived in the area, who would come and either cut the timber or pasture cattle there. So overall, just conditions of very dire poverty. About this time, well, during the Civil War, shortly after that, Watuppa continues this kind of military tradition. There were 4 young men from Watuppa who served with the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, colored, during the Civil War. Massachusetts had 1 regiment of cavalry that was made up entirely of people of color. And Charles Page, who was a grandson of Daniel Page, who had fought in the Revolution, fought with the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. This was a unit that was fought at the Battle of Petersburg in the Civil War, and was one of the first units to enter Richmond, Union units to enter Richmond at war's very end. Their commanding officer was Charles Francis Adams, Jr., who was the grandson of President John Quincy Adams, great-grandson of President John Adams. So they had a man in command who had some useful political strings that he could pull. Shortly after the Civil War, you have the legislature passes what's called the Magna Carta of Massachusetts Indians in 1869. And the law provided that all the land that had been held by the state as Indian land until that time could be owned in fee simple. In other words, owned individually by Indians and bought and sold. Indians did not have the right to own land, period, under the old law of Massachusetts. A couple of the other old laws that were done away with this time I found kind of interesting. One had to do with the provision of alcohol to Indians. Now, since the earliest days of Plymouth Colony, there have been laws saying that you could not provide alcohol to Indians. But the Massachusetts statute that was in effect later provided an exception for medicinal purposes. But in order to do that, a physician had to be present while, and it was limited in amount to 1 dram of alcohol, where the Indian could consume 1 dram of alcohol. And the physician had to make an affidavit to a justice of the peace certifying that it was medically necessary to provide the Indian with the alcohol, which is a lot of trouble to go through, it seems to me, just to get a single drink. Another law which I found curious is that although Indians could own horses and buy horses, they could not, it was illegal to sell a mare, a female horse, to an Indian. For some reason, they were afraid that they would be breeding their own horses, and that if a constable witnessed an Indian in possession of a mare, the mare was to be seized and impounded and then sold at auction, and the proceeds forfeited to the state. The number of Indians over this entire 19th century keeps going down and down until by probably about 1870, you've only got Dr. William Perry and his family still living there. Now, Dr. Perry and his descendants, by the way, it's the only family living on the reservation today who apparently have been who they allege, and I take it as fact, have been in continuous possession since Dr. Perry's time. And remembering that Dr. Perry is the descendant of Captain James Church, so that makes an unbroken line of possession going all the way back to 1701, more than 300 years, really the same family, one line of descent from that same family. The Watuppa Indian Reservation was part, or very near, might say, the watershed for the reservoir system, which the rapidly growing city of Fall River was acquiring and developing starting in the 1880s. The city would buy up a lot of these farms, like some of those that were owned by my ancestors that I mentioned. They would buy up farms after someone had died at an estate sale or whatever, and then just let the land go fallow and let the houses just fall to pieces or move them elsewhere. And in order to, stop runoff and what have you from going into the reservoir system. And eventually the city started to cast its eye on the reservation land. And in 1907, they petitioned the legislature to seize the land at the for the reservoir watershed. And if there's a good part of that event happening, it was that the city attorney, a man by the name of Dubuque, wrote a very lengthy legal brief, which, if you throw out all the legal stuff, has a lot of the history of Watuppa Reservation contained within it. It is the best source by far for the history of the reservation. At the time, in 1907, it was Dr. Perry's widow still living there. Naturally, they objected. They said it was, this is our reservation and we have a right to be here. But they convinced the legislature that the state had the power to dispose of the land, and so the city got 105 acres, basically the land that was closest to North Watuppa, and that left 90 acres that tended to be the easternmost part, the land basically running on both sides of Indiantown Road away from the water. And this was still lived on by the Perry family. And in other words, living up in this area here, I think the house that's labeled Henry Crank is the one that in modern times has been occupied by the Perry family. This area here and to the west was seized by the city of Fall River. If you take a walk up or drive through that area today, if you go up Blossom Road, you'll notice that there's hardly any of these houses that are listed are still in existence. It's a very rural area, and that was done by the city to protect this watershed. It's probably the only area around here that I can think of that is less heavily populated today than it was 200 years ago. But the reservation is still in existence. There's a group, they call themselves the Pecasset Tribe of the Pokanoket Nation, which maintains a headquarters there. There's a descendant of Dr. Perry that still lives at the reservation. I think this is the 1895 map here. And by this time, there's one house that's on the north side of the road. That's marked W. Perry. That's Dr. Perry. As part of the seizure, they agreed to move the existing Perry house from the north side of Indiantown to the south side, where it exists today. But even from 1895, a lot of these houses no longer exist. It's a very rural area. Where it says Blossom Estate, that's the water company headquarters. This cemetery here is the Blossom Cemetery. The stones have been moved, but you can still see the cemetery walls. There were two Indian cemeteries at the reservation, one called the Old Cemetery and one called the New Cemetery. They were very close to the intersection of the two roads. Like most Indian cemeteries, there's not very little in terms of memorials left. There is, I've seen a photograph of one, although I haven't seen it in person, but there is a marker to memorializing Daniel Page, who, as I mentioned, was one of the heroes of the American Revolution in the raid on Prescott. But to again, to sum up, Watuppa, founded as a reservation for a specific group of veterans, if you will, Indian veterans of King Philip's and King William's wars. They continue a long military tradition that persists until modern times. In looking at this and other records relating to Watuppa, I think it may provide at least a partial answer to a question that has puzzled me for a long time. And that is, and just as we explored, for example, in the Paul Cuffey Symposium, you have a number of instances where African men are marrying Indian women in the 1700s. And the intermarriage, as Earl said in his census when I mentioned, in 1861, and Earl knew as much about the condition of Indians at that time as anybody, he said there is no one left in the state of Massachusetts who is a pure Indian. Everybody is intermixed. I don't know if I would go so far as to say the entire state of Massachusetts, but I think locally, at least in 1861, that would have been true. But what puzzled me is I get the idea of a surplus of African men, just because if we look at slave ship manifest, there were more men than women who were brought over from Africa. But the part about the shortage of Indian men puzzled me, because the usual explanation is that, well, after King Philip's War, the men were sold into slavery and went to places like Barbados or even into the American South. In places like North Carolina, we can trace some Indians being sold in slavery after King Philip's War. And the problem I have with that explanation is that while that might explain a shortage of Indian men in, say, the 1680s, 1690s, it does nothing to explain the shortage of Indian men locally that clearly still exist in the 1760s, 1770s, and 1780s, more than a century later. But it occurs to me that part of an explanation might be that many of these Indian men in that period between King Philip's War and, say, the Revolution were continually fighting in these French and Indian wars. And if you read Church's account of these eastern expeditions, these were pretty bloody campaigns. And the Indians were involved far out of proportion to their number locally. Church used to go with 50 Indians and just 100 white men. But obviously by that time, the ratio of white men to Indian men locally was much, much higher than that. And so a lot of them may have died in these wars, and that may be one way to account for that shortage. But in any event, as I said, Watuppa really founded as an award to veterans, Indian veterans. Many of them fought in many other wars since that time, and has been continuously occupied for over 300 years. And I think because of the records of Watuppa, it gives us a little bit of insight into how some of these families are put together. We take Watuppa records, we then take the vital records, which otherwise are just bits and pieces, which we have a lot of trouble putting together. With the assistance of those Watuppa records, we can start fitting some of these people into families, and which would really help us build a kind of genealogical record of these early Wampanoag families that doesn't exist. Thank you.